Hello, my name is Christine Jeske, and I was so disappointed when I realized I wouldn't be able to make it to these meetings. Thank you to those of you who worked to set this up so that I could share this video anyway. And I want to be honest up front, the one and only reason that I'm bothering to even make this video is because I would love to connect to you all. To me, that's part of the joy of coming to a conference like this, is you get to meet people who are interested in similar topics. So please jot down my email if there's a comment, a question, something that you are researching that's similar, even just to say, hey, I actually saw this video. I would love to hear from you. So I hope that we'll still have some opportunity to connect, even if I'm not there in person. So this talk, let me share my PowerPoint with you all. So there's my contact information there. You can find my website and Substack too if you want, but I'd love to just hear from you. So about this talk, it's called What Ethical Butchers and Anti-Racist Christians Have in Common, Enchanted Transformations. When I saw the topic of enchantment in the call for papers this year, I couldn't decide which of two topics I wanted to speak about that I've done research on, because I realized both of them have to do with enchantment. And so I took a leap and decided to combine them both. So this talk is a mashup of two seemingly unrelated studies that I have been conducting over the last few years. And I hope if you're interested, you will check out articles on each of them that go into more detail. So I have an article already out called Re-enchanting Meat, How Sacred Meaning Making Strengthens the Ethical Meat Movement in Agriculture and Human Values that you can find. And then a forthcoming article, Unlearning Hope, White Christian Encounters with Grace as a Logic of Exchange, that's in the Economic Anthropology, that's coming out soon. And I also have an article in the Journal for Anthropology of North America on a related topic of hope and whiteness that's already out. So what I'm doing in this talk is pulling together the evidence of each of these two studies into a new argument, which is this: re-enchantment offers a meaning-making strategy for fostering transformation in contexts that threaten harmony. So first, what do I mean by enchantment? Well, people have taken this word in many directions since Max Weber wrote about it, and he took it from Schiller or someone else. But as a basic definition, we can start with the opposite, disenchantment. Weber writes, disenchantment is the knowledge or belief that there are no mysterious, incalculable forces that come into play, but rather that one can, in principle, master all things by calculation. Or as Richard Jenkins wrote, building on Weber, it's a process whereby the natural world and all areas of human experience come to be experienced and understood as less mysterious, defined, at least in principle, as knowable, predictable, and manipulative by humans, conquered by and incorporated into the interpretive schema of science and rational government. Disenchantment has been widely correlated with secularization and capitalism. And many recent scholars have noted that the reverse is also true, that re-enchantment often accompanies counter movements to capitalism and secularization in some of the most surprising settings. And today I'd like to point our attention to two of those settings. So the first setting is among ethical meat producers. From 2019 until 2021, I set out to study farmers and butchers in the United States involved in what has been dubbed the ethical meat movement. That is a cluster of production systems oriented toward values of ecological sustainability and the well-being of animals and humans. This might seem like a weird shift from an anthropologist who, myself, I was prior to this involved in studying racism in South Africa in workplaces. And yes, it was a weird shift. It came about because my partner and I were raising pigs in the United States, and we had been around a lot of meat animals in years past living outside the United States. And we noticed that Americans kept asking us questions like, how do you possibly eat those animals that you know by name? And I knew a lot of other small-scale sustainable meat farmers and butchers who put a lot of thought and intentionality into answering that question. So I decided to learn from them, and it was life-giving. And this is what I found. So just as disenchantment ushered people into modern industrial capitalist meat production, various forms of re-enchantment are accompanying some of the ways out. So what does that look like? As I said earlier, My larger argument is that enchantment offers a meaning-making strategy, particularly in contexts that threaten harmony. And eating meat is a harmony-threatening proposition. Philosophers, including Steve Loudon, have called this dilemma the meat paradox. That people simultaneously, this is the words, people simultaneously dislike hurting animals and they like eating meat. So people see those big round animal eyes, and at the same time, they crave protein, and the route from point A to B involves death. And it feels wrong, and maybe it is wrong. Vegans have many good reasons for saying so. But over the last few decades, a growing movement, including thought leaders like Michael Pollan and Thomas Davis, have argued that eating meat can be ethical, and the way to make it so is counterintuitively to get closer to our meat sources. And at the same time, many of these have argued not to over-rationalize it, but to embrace the mysterious intercreaturely connections forged through care and death and eating. And this goes against much of the dominant symbolic code of meat in North America. The anthropologist Sophia Estacio argues that modern meat practices use peculiar strategies for dealing with the meat paradox. She calls these strategies technologies of effacement. They're strategies to prevent humans and animals from interacting with each other as morally significant others. The history of industrialized meat is one of increasing effacement, as well as related shifts at the spiritual level. As one example, the 1952 Catholic Book of Prayers, the Roman Ritual, I found includes several prayers reflecting ties between the church and agricultural life. Blessings for herds and bees and pastures, stables, and a very memorable blessing for lard or bacon, depending on the translation, with instructions to sprinkle the lard with holy water and speak these words, "Lord, bless this creature lard and let it be a healthful food for mankind." But here's the thing, revisions in subsequent decades removed these kinds of prayers relating spirituality to agriculture. Similarly, a Presbyterian prayer book published in 2012 includes prayers for pets, but no prayers relating to processing food animals. Evidence of this shift in human-animal relations from farm to domestic into control. The disappearance of meat animals from Christian discourse is emblematic of the wider loss of sacredness in meat systems throughout the United States and Europe. The industrial meat complex and its attendant beliefs made knowing one's source of one's meat both unlikely and even undesirable to many people. Even amidst the hegemony of these trends, however, disenchantment has always been subverted by oppositional re-enchantments. And we can see this within the ethical meat movements. As producers aim to create a thriving market among buyers who prefer meats precisely for their closeness to human care, they have built a symbolic code to justify this way of eating. And what was most striking to me in my research was that they used mystery and spirituality and sacredness within that justification. In my interviews, observations, and text analysis of farmers, butchers, chefs, and leaders in the movement, I found that people just kept talking about spirituality, whether or not they identified as religious. Butcher and educator Thomas Davis, for example, in her memoir, Killing It, writes that she hopes ethical meat practices will, quote, fill us with reverence, and this reverence will make us whole. She says that learning from French butchers made her feel a part of something bigger, something full of respect, and yes, maybe even sacred. And I heard these sorts of sentiments again and again. A farmer told me, probably the most religious thing I do every day is celebrate through the food I get to eat. It nourishes body, mind, and spirit. Often this came out in their descriptions of the moment of killing an animal. Several farmers who have their animals slaughtered on their own farms described a prayer-like moment before the animal's death. They might speak, quote, a quiet little thank you to the animals, or, quote, a non-religious thank you prayer. So why this proliferation of sacramental imagination among people who are ostensibly simply producing a market product? I suggest that discourses of enchantment work to dispel threats to harmony in at least two ways. First, they make sense of mortality. Killing meat animals brings humans face to face with guilt and shame surrounding killing in order to consume. As one farmer wrote about facing that meat paradox, quote, maybe reverence helps. Maybe killing the creature yourself helps. It completes the cycle somehow. Taking responsibility is somehow the balm that soothes the horror. Secondly, discourses of enchantment preserve non-commodifiable relations between animals and human lives. As one farmer put it, quote, "You need to eat the love you put into that animal." These discourses re-entangle the realms of that modernity sought to separate: sacred and profane, cultural and natural, economic and moral. Farmers and butchers were not opposed to making a profit in my research, but they highlighted the enchanted elements of that process. And so doing, they framed meat as relational, more like a gift than a market. And thereby they protected meat from a purely alienated commodification. Okay, so let's shift gears to the seemingly unrelated research I've been conducting more recently. In 2021, I decided to continue a research path that I'd been on in my previous book, The Laziness Myth, to study the ways that people pursue better lives in the context of racism. Specifically, in my new research, I began exploring the ways that Christians in the United States deal with racism. I was interested in the small subset of white Christians. According to some survey, this is about 9% of white Christians who are highly motivated to address racial injustice. Much like the ethical meat movement, these are people pushing against the tide. White Christians are less likely than white people more broadly, and much more likely than Black Christians to be committed to addressing racial injustice. And I wanted to understand what sustains those who are. So the 40 white people who were included in this study were each recommended through 30 interviews I conducted first with faith leaders of color, who talked about what racial justice meant to them and who should be included in the study. From those 70 interviews total, along with participant observation, I identified common elements in the journeys of white Christians who develop long-term commitments to racial justice. And here again, I found something we could call enchantment. I also found much of what you would likely expect of advocates for racial justice. White participants recommended for the research had spent years learning about the social context of racism, both through intellectual and experiential learning. But similar to raising ethical meat, being a white Christian actively attempting to address racism is what I would call a harmony-threatening situation. It is an existential crisis in some ways similar to the meat paradox. The more white people learn, the more they often become paralyzed by guilt and shame and evidence that reconciliation or reparations may never be possible. One approach that interlocutors had witnessed or tried themselves to deal with this paradox was this threat to harmony, was a sort of market logic to reparations, a tit for tat, pay it back until we're even approach. White people might imagine giving an apology and people of color returning that with forgiveness and all being finished. But both white and BIPOC interlocutors in this study describe that approach as ultimately unsatisfying, that a market approach to reconciliation is unsatisfying. Instead, interlocutors kept talking about a different kind of interaction that they referred to using the Christian term grace. Unlike a market logic, grace includes elements of mystery, sacredness, and limitless social responsibility. In other words, it includes enchantment. Drawing on scholarship and my interlocutors, I define grace as a gift freely given in the context of an unrepayable debt, which anticipates future responsibility. Interlocutors understood this form of interaction to be something sacred, modeled after the relationship between God and humans, and something which radically defied the relational forms of capitalism and rationalism. When I asked interlocutors about the most transformative moments in their journey toward anti-racism, white interlocutors told me story after story about grace, and people of color explained the term grace as well. As a few examples, one white woman described witnessing her white grandmother exhibit blatant racism to a Black caregiver in a nursing home. And then the Black caregiver bluntly called out the grandmother, but later the Black woman was the only person from the care facility to attend the grandmother's funeral. An undeserved, freely given gift. Many people told stories of warm welcomes into predominantly non-white churches. One said, "I was invited into a world that wasn't for me." A white pastor who had recently begun unlearning his own racism attended a predominantly Black church. Weeks later, he received a text message from the Black pastor of that church saying simply, "Hey, I'm missing you, man. I really appreciate you." And the white pastor described that moment as a critical moment of grace. He said, "It's wonderful to be loved by people that have every reason to hate you, but don't." These interlocutors applied grace not only in ways that were decolonial and anti-racist and anti-capitalist, but also enchanted. Grace, they believed, can only happen when the gift giver, in this situation, the person of color, is a free agent, free to give or not give without coercion from the recipient of grace. As one interlocutor put it, you don't, sorry, that's my earlier quote. One interlocutor put it, you don't get to demand grace. If you do, you've missed the whole point. As soon as you say, hey, I deserve grace, that's not grace anymore. And real grace, according to interlocutors, happens in the context of an unpaid debt. In this case, the debt that white people learned to recognize in the history of oppressions through land theft, enslavement, Jim Crow, and more. Instead of the debtor paying back the debt, as capitalism might expect, grace is a gift from the creditor to the debtor. It's a gesture communicating that both parties know the debt cannot ever be fully repaid, but relationship is possible anyway. In contrast to the cheap forgiveness often demanded of people of color in a caste-based society, this application of grace does not let people off the hook. Rather, it hooks people into relationship by anticipating future giving, both through paying back and paying forward. Like the logic of gift giving, it precipitates more giving and more responsibility for the other. Grace is a linchpin to creating harmony where harmony is seemingly beyond the realm of hope. So in both of these studies, the ethical meat producers and anti-racist white Christians, there's an otherworldliness, a release of control, an embrace of mystery, and a non-marketness at the center of relationships and systems. My argument is not that enchantment is the only way that humans sustain countercultural movements in the midst of disharmony, but that it does offer potential. In pursuing harmony in the context of both the meat paradox and irreconcilable legacies of racism, people turn to enchantment as one possible meaning-making strategy. I realize that's a lot to pack into one talk. I hope I have given you at least enough to spark some questions and some conversation. And as I said, I would love nothing more than to connect with you. Please send me a quick email if you're able with a question or comment or just to say you were here. And I hope that you enjoy the rest of the conference. And I wish you all the best.